we think it's equally important to understand the actual legal considerations of startup capital raising. And we'll get into what some of those are. But it's primarily what we would contain in this agenda over here. We want to know, firstly, why do startups even raise money? And then when we say where do they raise money from, again, we don't mean like where to find these investors. We more so mean what is the profile of different types of investors that might invest in your company. The third is that there's a real distinction, legal distinction, practical distinction, and documentary distinction between whether or not you're raising by giving out equity of your company or by taking on debt, or whether you're going to be using one of the more modern kind of hybrid approaches between equity and debt. And I totally appreciate that there's a lot of terminology, and I think we're going to speak a lot about this terminology. So I think what I'm going to ask right off the top of the bat is that if there's anybody that has any questions, submit them in the chat. I'll try to look at them somewhat regularly. And if we need to slow down or we need to explain a concept a little bit further, we'll do that. And if the question is sort of related to the topic that we're talking about, we'll answer it. If it's something that will be talked about afterwards in the presentation, then we'll talk about that as well when it comes up. But again, there's going to be a lot of terminology, so I'll try to slow down and explain them. We're going to explain equity and debt in a minute, so don't worry about that one for now. The next part is that we're going to be talking about, if you already know that you intend on raising and you have investors that are interested in your company, how do you prepare your actual startup, your documents, the requirements that you might have from an investor? How do you prepare for that capital raising? And then lastly, which I think is a really interesting summary, is just to explain kind of the common fundraising stages that startups typically go through. There's become almost like a pattern for startup raising that when we go through it, you'll again learn some of that terminology, and some of it might be familiar to you guys. Okay, so the first thing is, why would a startup raise money to begin with? And the simple answer is that in almost every scenario, if you are an innovative startup that has intentions of being sort of a high growth startup, you're almost always going to require external funding. I think the only scenarios that I can really think about where a startup doesn't really require external funding is if, the founder team maybe had some prior exits, already has quite a bit of cash, and they're willing to accept the real risk of putting that cash into a subsequent startup and not kind of mitigating that risk. That's one scenario that I can think of. Another one is sometimes spin out startups where, maybe the startup is created within a consulting business or a development agency, and then they spin it out. So maybe they already had most of the product already built and they can get to profitability. But in almost every other scenario, startups require a lot of money. They require money for the setup costs, the corporate matters, legal matters, accounting matters. Maybe you have to pay for an accelerator. Maybe you have to pay for an office space, marketing. And certainly if there's a really innovative startup that is building a product, you might have to pay for quite a bit of research and development. I think you can also think about it that the more complex the startup, the more complex the product, probably the more money you're going to need. And we call this a burn rate, right? So if you have a particular monthly amount that is your expenses and it covers your salaries, your development costs, your marketing, all that sort of stuff, that monthly amount is your burn rate. So you have to have enough capital to burn through that burn rate while you're trying to progress towards a point where you're actually able to have positive revenue and then even actual profit. So it takes time for a startup. Again, particularly like software or, innovative startups, technology-based startups, it takes time before they get to a point of profitability. Another reason why, as a founder, you might want to raise money is because instead of, remortgaging your house and putting your entire life's worth of savings into your startup, you might want to mitigate against that risk. You might be willing to put in some money. You might be willing to put in some investment, but you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. So you want to have the ability to take other people's money and to mitigate against that risk, so that it's not only you that's at risk, it's other people And sometimes if you can do it the right way, the money that you're taking is sort of cheap. We call it cheaper money, because if you're, as you'll see later on, if your startup is valued at a certain amount, the higher the value of your company that you're able to raise money at, the less you have to give up in exchange for that investment. So it becomes almost like a cheaper money that you're obtaining, and you're able to mitigate your own risk or your founder team's risk by taking on others' money. Lastly, there's one other kind of, unrelated benefit, which is that if you select the right investors that have broad networks or that have particular expertise, then you may be able to leverage that expertise, you may be able to leverage those networks as well. And that could open doors for your startup, by getting into those networks, by getting into, like other relationships as a result of those networks, and by having access to that expertise. So far, everybody good with me? Okay. I can't say anybody, but I'm going to assume yes. The next thing that I wanted to talk about was, we're calling it fundraising options, but again, it's not where to find the money necessarily, but more of, what's the typical profile of a quote unquote investor in a startup? What are the different ways to fund your startup? Well, the first is the one that we mentioned, where maybe you're a second-time founder that already has an exit, and you're willing to bootstrap the entire, cost of your business. Bootstrap is a term that refers to when you're kind of spending your own money for the growth of the startup, for the building and the growth of the startup, and you can potentially bootstrap up to a certain point and then take money, but that's one option. The next, which we're going to dive into deeply a little bit later on, is debt. Debt meaning someone is actually lending money to you, lending money to your startup, and you're utilizing that money again for some of the expenses of the business. We put bank debt as an example. If you can obtain bank debt on favorable terms, that might be something that you think is preferable, because then you don't have to give up any portion of your business in exchange for that debt. It's just that it's usually unlikely that a bank will lend money to a brand new startup that doesn't really have any history or traction or assets for which that the bank can secure their loans against. So it's a little bit harder to raise money from a bank, but it is still an option, and it is an option even at different points during the growth of the startup. There are some banks that are specifically tailored towards startup financing. One of them that we have worked with is BDC. We know that BDC gives out loans. There's other issues with BDC loans for startups, because they're not cheap loans. They're not like a loan with a low interest rate. There's a potentially high interest rate that you'd have to pay for that type of debt. And there's pretty specific terms that, we'll talk about in a bit. The other types are much more common for startup financing. So a lot of startups raise from this kind of group that we call friends and family, which we'll dive into in a second. Angel investors, which are, and for those of you who don't know, we call them angel investors because it's like they come down from the heavens with bags of cash and give it to you and for you to help grow your startups. But these are really kind of high net worth people who have made money and who are willing to make investments in early stage startups and to take early positions in early stage startups. There's different profiles of angel investors. Some are more targeted towards the earlier stage companies. Some are a little bit later stage companies, and you'll see in the next slide some of the differences between those two. And then you have sort of these private equity types of firms, some of which are focused on venture capital, focused on early stage startups. So these are typically funds, actual funds that are put together, that their intention is to invest in a number of startups and play the numbers, so that if they invest in 10 or 12 startups per year, the odds are is that a few of them will do quite well, and they'll be able to have an exit from those startups. So just to dive a bit deeper into a couple of these profiles, the friends and family and what we call early stage angels, this type of investor is usually issuing smaller check sizes. They're they're okay with a simpler form of due diligence on your business. So they're not going to spend, and nor do you want them to spend, a tremendous amount of time like digging into the details about your business, asking you a million questions. You're not asking them for a tremendous amount of money, so you're not willing to give them all kinds of information about your business for them to determine whether it's a worthwhile investment. These are investors that understand that they're just making, they're sort of betting on you. They're betting on the founder team. Friends and family, just to be very specific, is literally your friends and family. So if there are people that know you and trust you and believe in you and know what you are capable of, or know what your founder team is capable of, it's your own network that you're going to go and approach and say, you're building this startup, you're going to showcase it in some form of a pitch deck, or you might demo your product. And these are people that say, you know what, I want in, I believe in you. And so these are people who are within your network. It could be family, it could be friends, it could be close business associates that you have, but that's who we really mean. It's people within your network. Whereas the early stage angels could be within your network, but it could also come from different angel organizations as well. So you might pitch to an entire organization, and then there might be specific angel investors that are interested in investing in you. Again, the profile of this, when these investors are investing in your company, they're not as demanding. They're not going to really dig into the details of your business in terms of due diligence. And the other thing is they sort of understand they're going to have to take simpler terms when you're offering them an investment. They're not going to have as many protections or as many preferences. Whereas on the other hand, you have these really sophisticated venture capital funds and these what we refer to as super angels, which are even higher net worth people who are investing in maybe later stage companies. These are people that are going to be giving much larger checks. So in exchange for a much larger check, you have to presume that they have more leverage in this negotiation. Generally, they have more leverage. I mean, there could be a scenario where your startup, is been able to solicit so many interested investors that you really have the leverage and you can dictate the terms. But a lot of times, the startups, when they're trying to take larger check sizes, it usually comes from more sophisticated angels or VCs, and in exchange for those larger check sizes, the investors are going to want to be much more aggressive in terms of how they negotiate their investment terms. They're going to want to have a number of protections in place. They might want to sit on the board. They might want to have preferences over and above even the founder group in relation to their investment. The benefit with these groups is that they have incredible networks, and they really can open up a ton of doors for the startups, make a ton of connections, and they can even, selecting the right venture capital fund could really make or break a startup with their network and with their investments. There's also, sort of that notion that if the right VC fund invests into your startup, then that by itself makes the startup more interesting for other money to come in the door or for other potential acquirers to come in the door. The one potential negative is that the VCs are sort of hyper-focused on growing the business to a certain degree and then achieving what we call an exit, so actually selling the business, or maybe in a very rare scenario, taking that business public. They're really hyper-focused on getting a return on their investment, because that is the nature of their business. They give you money so that they can make more money off of the money they gave you. So, there might be an encouragement to push towards an exit. And that's the reason why they also want to sit on the board and want to have certain rights in relation to the decision-making of the startup. I want to pause there because even that was kind of, intense. Is there anybody that has any questions about that so far?
I think I have a more like a comment, and this is a big difference from some of the companies that I have in the region, that they sometimes deal with investors just because they have money and not because they have the expertise in the market. So in general, I guess that what you mentioned about the investor is that the network of the investor is extremely important for the startup, in particular when the startup is approaching somebody here. So it's more like what we call sometimes like smart money, right? It's not just about the money, but it's also about the expertise and the network that they have. So this is very important for you guys to be approaching with investors also, asking questions about their own network and how they can help you more than giving you money, because that's I think it's very important. I don't know, Alan, if you have any recommendations when you are approaching to investors, and what will be the right questions to ask in that regard, so the startup know that, you know, this is a venture capital or an investor that can actually help my company further more than just the money.
I think there's one obvious thing that you can ask, which is, what is the portfolio of your prior investments and the success of that portfolio? For example, if you're a med tech startup or an education tech startup, I know that I don't know if Beatrice is on the phone or not, but there's different, you know, types of technology. So if you're in the educational technology sector, if you're in the medical technology sector, maybe, you know, you want to take smart money from a venture capital fund that has had already prior experience with that type of technology, that has network contacts and relationships within the ed tech space or the med tech space, and maybe even has had their portfolio companies have successful exits, and that they've learned what led them to that successful exit. So I think that's definitely one of the things that you can ask, and you should look at capital raising as a mutual a mutual interview. The same way they are interviewing you, the same way you're pitching to them with your pitch deck to get them to express interest in investing in you, you also want them to pitch you on their fund and on their you know, on their principles and on the portfolio of companies that they have. And then you're going to want to be selective if you have the leverage. Not everybody has the leverage. You have to have a certain amount of traction in your startup, I think, to be able to attract enough money or enough interested parties that you could be selective. Not everybody can be selective. So I think you sometimes have to be realistic about that.
Yeah, Ingrid has a question. Ingrid, go ahead.
Hi, it wasn't a question, but more of one of the tips that I received from a friend of mine that raised a lot in terms of the smart money, which is asking the investor how their reporting looks like with their startup. So how many times do they talk to the startup founders? How do they expect to be reported? Is it just quarterly and that's it? Or is it something that, and because also there is the caveat that some investors want to be too hands-on and don't let you do the business. So you have to, like, there's the smart money and then there's the investor that want to act kind of like a founder. So that would be like, that's one of the red flags that can come up that I've heard in the market as well.
I think that's a good point. I think the other comment that I'd make there, and you'll see it in a tiny bit when we get into the typical terms or things that these VCs normally ask for, not to toot our own horns, but honestly, you're going to be presented with a set of terms from that VC fund. And sometimes they are overbearing. Sometimes they want to have too much control, or they want to have too much say, or they want to have veto rights over the decision-making of the board, which is, you know, in an early stage company, usually comprised of the founders. And so those are the types of things that you need to be educated on when you get to those terms. So you need to have, you know, honestly, lawyers on your side that can review those terms correctly and that can advise you the risks of accepting those terms. So good point. Moving on, this is one of the, you know, key terminology distinctions that I want to make here: equity versus debt financing. There's one other question that came up. Oh, okay, that was just a nice comment from Ingrid. And then Leonardo said, everybody seems to be using the SAFE. We will talk about the SAFE. Just give me a minute and we're going to get to the SAFE in a minute. So in terms of terminology, equity versus debt financing, this is like a real distinction when you're talking about raising capital. What is equity? What is debt? We kind of talked about debt a little bit earlier. Debt is ultimately a loan. And by definition, a loan is something that has to be repaid. And it's usually something that has to be repaid plus interest. So, you know, think about any other loan. Someone lends you money, you got to pay it back on a particular date, which we call the maturity date, the date that the loan becomes due. And that loan has to be repaid with a level of interest. If it is 100% straight debt, a straight loan, then it's not something that gets factored into your cap table. Some of you may be familiar with that term, cap table, which is, you know, your capitalization, who are the shareholders of your company or the potential shareholders of your company. It's not affected by that. But it's not always straight debt, which we'll talk about in a minute. And in some scenarios, the only way that you'll be able to get a loan, particularly a bank loan, is if the interest and the fees are fairly high, because it's such a risky proposition to lend to a startup that it has to be really worthwhile. So usually the loan would contain like a real heavy interest and fee component, and may even be secured against certain assets of the business, or quite frankly, the founders might have to personally guarantee that loan as well. So that is taking money more as a loan. There are scenarios, which the next few slides we'll talk about, where there could be a debt, type of scenario, a loan given to you that instead of only needing to pay it back in cash, you could potentially have it converted into what we call equity, into shares. So what is equity? Equity is usually shares of the business. It's when the company gives out actual portions of the ownership of the business in exchange for that investment. There are other forms of equity that are not straight up shares, but that have the ability to become shares. Options, for example, warrants, for example, are forms of equity. The idea here is that an investment could be made, and it could be converted into shares eventually in an option scenario or a warrant scenario. It's the right to buy in at a later point in time. It's the right to pay a particular exercise price and then be given the shares. So some of the major differences here is that when you're giving out equity of your business, those investors actually become shareholders and own a part of your company. So I don't have it listed on the slide here, but there are real differences in terms of the documents then as a result of the equity versus debt. If you are giving out shares of your company, presumably you want the shareholder, the investor, to be subject to a shareholders agreement for sure, which would govern the relationship between all of the shareholders of the company. Those shareholders may negotiate specific rights that they get depending on the amount of money that they invest. Whereas with debt, it's, again, like we talked about, it might be a loan agreement. It might be something that they want to secure against certain assets or have a personal guarantee from the founders. Another key factor, which is what we're going to talk about next, is the fact that pre-revenue technology businesses, so you're building a software company and you're really nowhere near offering licensing to that software yet, but you still need to raise money for research and development and for building the product. They're very hard to value, those businesses. It's you'd have to use comparables, and ultimately it's whatever it is that you can sort of sell to an investor. So it makes it difficult to offer straight equity, because you have to set an actual price that they're buying in at your company at. So that's why we started to see what we call non-priced rounds. A non-priced round, I left the definition up there. Non-priced round is basically when there is an actual equity investment made into the company. So again, we're not talking about a loan necessarily, or it could be potentially a sort of a hybrid loan that can convert to equity. But it's a scenario where you're offering securities in your business, you're offering ownership of your business, at least at some point in time, without agreeing to the actual valuation of your business, because we don't know. It's very hard to value these businesses when there's no revenue, there's no comparable, there's no market necessarily for what it is that you're doing. So the real benefit of what we call a non-priced round, and I forget who it was that asked the question. Oh, Leonardo. We're going to talk in a second about how you can do a non-priced round using different instruments. But the real value is that you're delaying that discussion of evaluation. You're saying, I don't know what my business is worth, but I promise you, whatever it's worth in the next round of financing, you're going to get usually a discount from that valuation that we're able to set more definitively at the next round of financing, or you will be able to invest at a maximum valuation, which we call a valuation cap. So even if I think in the next round of financing, my business will be worth $20 million, if you invest with what's called a valuation cap at $10 million, then the maximum you will buy in at is $10 million, even if my business is worth double that afterwards. So it creates a benefit for the investor to invest earlier. The non-priced rounds in some ways really benefit the founders, because again, it allows you to take investment without almost like cheapening your business by undervaluing your company. If you don't know your valuation, the only way an investor might invest at real, definitive valuation is if the valuation is very low. So you're saying, I don't know my valuation, so you're going to buy in at just a discount of the next valuation. What that usually results in is that the money ends up coming in at a higher valuation rather than a lower valuation. The other real benefit is that it's a lot faster, theoretically, and cheaper to take this investment. The documents are, I wrote in quotations, simpler, because there are real pitfalls, which I listed under the cons as well. They're intended to be a lot simpler. It's definitely cheaper and simpler than certain types of equity financing where you have a real priced round. But it's not necessarily simple. And there are some things you got to be really careful about, which is why under the cons we said here, there are some stuff that you really should be watching out for. And that's what we're going to talk about today as well. And you should have someone, a lawyer on your side that's really explaining to you the differences here, because you may be presented with edits to a document that you gave, or maybe they give you a form of an agreement that you really have to be able to determine how it will affect you as a founder, whether you will be diluted heavily as a result of the document that you're given. And you'll see that some of the language you'll learn about is something called, pre-money versus post-money investments. There's some real pitfalls in the documents relating to how the quote unquote company capitalization is listed. So we'll talk about that in a second. Lastly, the last kind of negative part of a non-priced round is that because the investors are really just they're really just promising to invest later on during your next round of financing, you could have the scenario where when they convert to become investors, you have a larger number of people, a larger number of investors that actually have investor rights and preferences. And the reason for this is because, and we'll try to skip to the next slide here. The reason for this is because the two major ways that you do a non-priced round are with these types of instruments where there's basically an investment made now, but if they receive shares, they're receiving shares later on, and they're receiving shares, the type of shares that are negotiated by the next round of financing. Okay, so if you're taking in what we refer to as, let's say, a pre-seed round of financing, which we're going to give you the definitions of all those terms afterwards. If you're taking in a pre-seed round of financing, early money, and you're doing so under one of these quote unquote simpler methods, these investors ultimately convert at a next round of financing, maybe a Series A round of financing, where it is usually negotiated by a much more sophisticated institutional investor like a VC fund, who is going to negotiate real preferences for that fund. And if they negotiate real preferences, then everybody converts at that preference, at those sort of preferred terms. Not only the investors at that Series A round, but also the investors from the prior round as well. So that's one negative, going back to the cons over here. Okay, so to get into the actual types of non-priced rounds, we talked about debt, and we talked about how usually debt refers to like an actual loan that has to be paid back. But there's also this type of loan called a convertible note or a convertible debt. And this is still a loan. It's a loan, and it does have to be paid back, and it does have a maturity date, which is the date that the loan is due. And it does have interest typically, except that there is this opportunity that instead of paying back the loan with cash, you actually pay back the loan by converting it into shares on what's called a next qualified financing. So again, if the convertible note investment is made in a seed round, it could potentially convert into shares if you do another round of financing that meets certain criteria. And whatever you can make whatever that criteria is. We could say that it's only considered a quote unquote qualified financing if the next round of financing raises at least $1 million at a particular valuation. Whatever the terms are, the idea is that if you are able to achieve that next round of financing, and that next round of financing meets that criteria that you set to consider it qualified, like enough of a financing, then you can, instead of paying back the loan, you can convert the loan into shares, so that you don't have to repay the loan. And the theory here is that you really are going to need more and more money for one of those high growth, innovative startups. You may not necessarily be in a position to even repay the loan when the loan becomes due. So you really want to try to position your startup so that you can raise money again before the maturity date. With convertible notes, because there is interest, it's important to note that the interest tacks on to the principal amount of the loan. And so if you had an investment, let's say of $100,000 in a convertible note, it's not just the $100,000 that becomes shares, it's the 100,000 plus the interest that can convert to shares as well. You'll see that the similarity with the SAFE is that in both scenarios, there's this, offering of a cap, valuation cap, or a discount on the next round of financing. So if there is a qualified financing, then they still only convert at that maximum valuation that you're agreeing to in the convertible note, or some discount, or both. It is complicated. So even before I go to the SAFE, I want to pause there and see if people have questions about the convertible note. I can't see the hands. I know you guys use the hands. Anybody?
I don't see any questions so far, Allan.
Okay, that must mean everybody's an expert and knows exactly what we're talking about. And I know we're running a little bit behind, so I'm going to try to move on. But this is complicated stuff. It's going to take some time, and I truthfully never practiced this, so I have no idea how long it takes. But we'll just try to move as quickly as we can. So let me go back here. So the other way that has become really popular, maybe even more popular for certain early stage financings, Leonardo asked about this a touch earlier, or was it Leandro? I forget who it was, Leandro or Leonardo. So is the SAFE. The SAFE stands for Simple Agreement for Future Equity. And this was a type of document that was created by lawyers in conjunction with a major accelerator called Y Combinator. And the idea is that it was too difficult for startups to raise money quickly and cheaply, that they got bogged down in the negotiation of the valuation. If it was an equity financing, they also got bogged down in the details of convertible notes. So they wanted to come up with a really, like, quote unquote, simple way of raising money. And the idea here is that they wanted to make this document like pretty standard, that startups can present to investors, early stage investors. Again, early stage investors, you'll see it primarily, will be like friends and family or angel investors. And they wanted to say, this is typical, this is standard. And the way the SAFE works is that, unlike the convertible note, there is no actual need to pay back the amount that's invested. It is a committed investment that does not have a maturity date. But like the convertible note, the intention with the SAFE is that it actually does convert at the next round of financing as well. The newer SAFEs simply say that when the company does its next preferred round of financing, meaning, an equity financing where they actually, exchange shares for an investment, that's when the amount that was invested at the SAFE round converts. And what price does it convert at? Again, it converts at whatever the valuation cap is that's negotiated in the SAFE, or some sort of discount from the valuation of the next round of financing. You're seeing the SAFE also at Y Combinator itself has started to evolve. It started off as something we call a pre-money SAFE, which means that the valuation cap that's listed, you actually add the money that was invested on top of that. So it was before the money invested, that's the valuation that you're referring to. Whereas now they're referring to a post-money SAFE, which means that after all the money is invested in the next round of financing, that's the valuation cap. And there's real differences between a pre-money and post-money. The post-money is much more investor-friendly, and it can be problematic for founders if it's not modeled correctly. We'll show you an example of modeling really briefly, how you really have to understand the effects of using these instruments. You really have to know, how the founders will be diluted if you use convertible notes or safes. The other method, which you'll see more in later stage financing, is an actual priced round of financing. So in this case, we know the exact valuation of the company. You're offering your shares to investors at a particular price per share, which would allow you to calculate the overall sort of stated value of your business. You're telling the investors, this is how much we think we're worth. Okay, so you either, again, formulate it as this is how much we think we're worth before your investment, or this is how much we think you're worth after your investment. Again, the pre-money versus post-money. But either way, we have an actual price that the investors will pay for your shares. So the benefit here for the investors is that it's super clear. They know what they're getting. They're putting money in now for an actual amount of shares. They also usually would negotiate very specific terms. They would know exactly what rights they have. If they are sophisticated investors that are getting preferred shares versus the basic common shares, then they are going to negotiate certain preferences for those preferred shares. That's why it's called preferred shares. They have a preference over the common shareholders, which we'll show in the next slide. So these are heavily negotiated, usually by what we call a lead investor. So if you have a priced round, maybe you're raising $1 million, but 500,000 of it will come from one VC fund, and the rest of it might come from angels or smaller VCs. So whoever is leading that financing round will usually negotiate the basic terms, as well as potentially negotiate specific rights for themselves as a lead investor, which might include the board seat, it might include certain veto rights, that sort of stuff. And like we talked about, as soon as you do a price round, if you did it according to sort of the common method, which we'll show you, then if you had safe holders, if you had convertible note holders, and this price round was considered quote unquote qualified, then all those other non-priced equity holders, all the other safe holders, all the other convertible note holders will now convert to the same terms. So if that lead investor, negotiated really favorable terms to the investors, everybody else will benefit from those same terms. I'll finish this slide and then we'll see if we have any questions on that. So there are two main types of price rounds. One is you just literally offer common shares. So the same type of shares that the founders have in the corporation, you're offering to the other shareholders. So they don't have any real preference. The investors don't have any real preference over the founders. They don't have what we call liquidation preferences. So if the business had to dissolve or had to distribute its assets, the common shareholders don't have a preference over the other shareholders. Preferred shareholders do. So they would get their initial investment back before the rest of the assets are distributed. The preferred shareholders also might negotiate anti-dilution rights, meaning that they have mechanisms, and there's many different mechanisms, and they're super complex, but they have mechanisms built into the documents that protect them from being diluted, meaning having less of a percentage in the company over time. Common shareholders don't have those types of protections typically. It's possible that some common holders have something called a preemptive right, where they have a permission to buy in subsequent rounds, but primarily the preferred shareholders have these anti-dilution methods. For common shareholders, they could be voting, they could be non-voting. Usually the founders, directors, officers have voting shares, whereas employees and contractors and advisors might be issued shares pursuant to an option plan, so they might be non-voting. Whereas preferred shares, might have the ability to vote, 1-to-1 as if they were converted into common shareholders. So they might have voting, the preferred shares, that might happen as well. Another big difference between the two is that the dividends, meaning the extra profits that the business might have at a particular period of time, that is going to be paid out to the investors and paid out to the shareholders. The board really decides how they want to declare the dividends to the common shareholders. They're what we call discretionary. Board decides. Whereas preferred shareholders, sometimes it's like they have like a guaranteed return. They have what we call fixed dividends. So they have to be paid out a certain percentage of their investment on a yearly basis. And this way, it's almost like they're being paid back their initial investment and get to keep the rest of the investment to ride it for later on. these types of financings can get very complicated, extremely complicated. And for that reason, they're really expensive to do. It's particularly preferred share investments, which is again the reason why you had those accelerators like Y Combinator saying, let's do safe agreements, let's do convertible notes, because we can do a financing round for, you know, a lot cheaper, whatever, $5,000 to $10,000 of legal, whereas preferred share financings could be $30,000 to $50,000 to $60,000 to $100,000 worth of legal, depending on what round of financing and who the investors are and how complicated it gets. So it could be very expensive, and it's very, very complicated. I want to pause there for a minute. We can try to run through the rest of it fairly quickly, but that was the real meat of the presentation that had the majority of the kind of difficult concepts. So I want to know if anybody has any questions at this point.
It's very complex, actually, all those concepts. I don't know, Leonardo, or I see Mario open your mic.
Oh, somebody put their hand up, but I missed it.
Is Amir? Amir, go ahead.
Hi, Alan. Thank you very much for this presentation. I have I need some advice. We have different cooperation in different countries. Like, for example, we have headquarters in Hong Kong, and also we have a company in Brazil, and we lately opened our company in Canada. If we are going to raise money in North America, for instance, how we can clean, as you put it here in this slide, the relation, and also for the due diligence that they want to have, how we can prepare those, and how much it costs for us if we are going to raise some funds.
I was actually, because it's LATAM Startups, I was anticipating that exact question. And let me say it this way. Generally, investors will want to invest in a company that owns the entire business, right? You know, that owns all the assets, that owns the intellectual property. They're not going to want to invest if the Brazilian company owns the IP or owns the software and it's simply licensing it to a Canadian subsidiary that was incorporated for the purposes of Startup Visa, or to operate the Canadian operations. The Canadian business doesn't have the value. The value is contained wherever the assets are contained, wherever the overall value of the business is contained. So there's no simple answer here, because ultimately it has to be, you probably need to decide upon an overall corporate structure, and there may need to be what we call reorganizations done of the corporate structure in advance of doing a capital raising round. We know that from working with different companies, initially foreign-based companies that have been already established in Brazil or Peru or India or wherever, that are then want to move to North America. Ultimately, you have to decide what your corporate structure is, where the value is going to be contained. We might end up working with your foreign counsel and your foreign tax team to decide upon who would be the parent company, and whether the parent company will own subsidiaries. Let's say, maybe the parent company is the Canadian company that will then own the LATAM company, or that might then own another company. And then the investment should happen at the parent level is where the investment should happen, at the parent level, because that means that if the investor is investing there, then they're investing in everything. If they're only investing in the sub, that means they're not investing in everything. So, and there's no one simple answer. And I can tell you that this has been one of the most complicated things that we've got to deal with portfolio companies from LATAM Startups, because we have to involve Brazilian tax advisors, Brazilian corporate, and we have to work together in order to decide upon appropriate structures, having an understanding of both the corporate law and tax implications in both jurisdictions.
Just want comment to add it, because we don't have any revenue, because we just med tech, and still we need to have lots of work to do to launch our product. We already have an accountant in Hong Kong. Here we have Contabilizate's accountant, but we don't have that much transaction in our bank account. How we can deal?
It's still the same consideration, and what I don't want to do, just because we don't have a lot of time, is I don't want to dig into specific situations. If you have a specific situation, feel free to reach out, and then we can talk
for
about
sure.
it. But generally, it's something that has to be assessed on a case-by-case basis, where we have to understand your corporate structure and then decide what's the best approach. Probably working in conjunction with your advisors and in jurisdictions. And if you're missing advisors, we'll tell you to get them. I want to go to Mario quickly, but then after that, we got to move on and finish the rest of the topic.
Yes, thank you, Alan. Very quickly, the question. Well, here we have to, let's say, to deal with two issues. One is to find someone that wants to invest in our company. That's the first challenge. And the second one, the execution of that investment, no?
Correct.
As we're talking right now. My question is, to get someone to invest in our company, I think it's a full-time job. It's
Correct.
not to the one sheet, the deck, and the networking. It's a lot of work.
Totally.
So my question here is, do you recommend that let's say that we can hire like someone who does all this work in our name, the networking, to prepare the deck, everything, so we can go faster in this regard? Or because sometimes when I do that by myself, I think that I'm wasting my time, because you talk with people.
Yeah. I've heard consulting companies that specialize in deck preparation and investor readiness. Sometimes they work out really well. Other times you have a really dynamic CEO type of person who communicates really well, who pitches really well, and then they don't need the that type of advisory service. So I think it really is, you probably would want to try your hand at your own network and see if you're able to obtain success, and then if you're not, then you could try the things. But I don't have a preference one way or another. I think it's very dependent on your business. There are some businesses that literally just by their nature, they are just so interesting and so unique, and they have registered IP, and so in that scenario, you might have people knocking down your door. And if you have a scenario where you don't have people knocking down your door, then you have to try different approaches.
Okay. Well, of course, you're not going to give me a name of a consultant, no? But I mean, where can I get those names, at least to talk with someone and just to understand?
I know an amazing person that you could speak to. Her name is Miriam Lazarte, and
yeah, well, she's helping a lot, by the way.
So yeah. I would defer to Miriam.
Okay.
I got some people to give you, Mario, if you need that.
Okay.
I got to move on.
Yeah,
but
thank you.
This is sort of just a quick slide to introduce. There are a number of things that you may or may not have to do to prepare for a capital raise, depending on the type of capital raise that it is. But you'll see that for sure you have to have clean records. So when we were talking earlier about reorganizing your business, that's all part of making sure that your documents are clean, your corporation was set up correctly, you have a correct minute book, you have a properly created cap table. That's going to be something that is likely going to be asked for by the investors. They're going to want to see this information to know what they're investing into. They're going to want to see your articles. They're going to want to see your minute book. They want to see all that stuff. The second is what we call cap table modeling, which I'm actually going to move on to the next slide here. I put a little video. I don't know if you guys can see here. Carta, there's a number of tools, but one of them is Carta, where you can actually start to model out how the founders will be diluted depending on what type of investments you're offering. And you'll see that Carta allows you to make the distinction if it's a safe, if it's a convertible note, if it's pre-money, if it's post-money, what the valuation cap is, what the principal, what the discount. So there's no doubt in my mind that you should not be taking investment unless you model out what the effect of that investment will be. You don't just take money without knowing how the founders will be diluted. So having a tool like this is extremely valuable. I mean, this one's free, safes.carta.com. You can write that down and look it up and play around with these numbers, but it teaches you, how you and your founder team will result once you take that money, what the dilution will be depending on what you offer to different investors. So that's something that I think is really important to understand as well. Some types of financing rounds are better served if you summarize the terms of those deals in what we call a term sheet. Again, if you have a really early stage business that that is just taking money in a safe or in a convertible note, you might just be able to offer the safe itself without really summarizing the terms in a term sheet. But some investors want to agree to agree. So rather than giving them all the documents and spending the money on all the documents, you prepare a pretty simple non-binding term sheet, it's called, meaning that signing the term sheet doesn't mean that you're committed to doing the investment. And that term sheet really summarizes the business details of what it is that you're going to be agreeing to. So is it what's the type of security that's being offered? Is it a convertible note, a safe, a preferred share offering? How much are we raising in this round of financing? What's the valuation? What are the share terms? What are the documents going to look like afterwards? So that's what's contained in a term sheet. Okay, LATAM just posted safe.car, so that's great. In later stage financing, ones that is usually like more of a preferred share financing, again, the investor wants to know everything about your business, almost like as if it was an M&A transaction. If they were going to buy your business, they would want all information about your business. They would want to know your finances through financial statements. They're going to want to know your corporate matters. They're going to want to know if you've registered or protected any intellectual property. They want to know if you're compliant with regulations. They want to see what material agreements you sign. So this goes to the fact that as we're, us, when we're acting for a lot of you guys as clients of ours, we have to be actively involved in the business at all times, because we are going to track all of your documents and maintain them in an organized manner and have all of them in an organized manner, so that if an investor asks for them, we can present them in the correct way in what we call a data room. A data room, it usually is like a Dropbox or a Google Drive. There's some other more sophisticated ones, but it's basically a cloud drive where we organize all your documents, where we're able to respond to questions about your business. And there's normal things that are asked for by these investors. We listed some of them here. So we're able to respond to those queries, those questions in an easy way by presenting them on a shared drive. Okay, so that's a data room. One of the last points I want to make is you can't just take money from anybody. It's actually not allowed. It's like against securities law to take money from just anybody. There's a general rule that investors need to be very well informed about a private business that they're going to invest into. If you were buying a stock of a public company, the public company has public disclosure. So you can read all about the business, all about their finances, all about their team, their personnel. You can read all about everything, which is why anybody's allowed to buy from a public company, because everybody could be well informed about that public company if they want to be. But you cannot buy shares, or you cannot offer shares from a private company to just anybody. They have to fall under particular categories of investors, unless you take the time to create a disclosure document. No startup creates a disclosure document, so that's not a path. No one goes and creates a prospectus for a startup company to receive financing. So what they do instead is they only offer investment to certain categories of investors. Those are, and you'll see the familiarity with some of the terms we used before, these friends and family and close business associates. That's an actual category of investor that's permitted under securities law. Employees, consultants, officers, directors, another actual category, which is why you see startups, create stock option plans where they issue options which can be converted into shares for those employees. If someone was a prior holder of shares in your company, they can reinvest afterwards because they're already familiar with your company. And the last one, which is probably the most important one, are what we refer to as accredited investors. So without getting too specific into what an accredited investor is, I'll just say the theory is that securities law assumes that if someone has enough money, they are presumed to be smart enough to ask for information about your business, due diligence about your business. Enough money for an individual is someone who earns at least $200,000 a year, or with their spouse $300,000 a year, or has a certain amount of net assets. And the net assets don't include your house usually. Okay, so it's like $1 million in net assets, not including your house. Corporate investors have different sort of numbers that they have to meet in order to become an accredited investor. When you're taking investment from any of these categories of people, the documents have to reflect that you, as a corporation has done enough work to confirm that those people are accredited investors. So it's normally done by way of this certificate that the investor has to fill out saying, I meet the criteria because I make $200,000 a year, or whatever the case might be. So again, I don't want to be overly specific here because it can get really complicated. But this is another kind of, trap that the lawyers have to be really aware of and advise you at the time that you're raising money, who you're allowed to raise money from, who you're not allowed to raise money from. Lastly, I just want to show you some kind of standard ways that fundraising happens with startups. So there's different terms that you may have heard along the way: seed, pre-seed, early stage, mid and late growth startups. So the pre-seed round is usually when you're raising at a really early stage. You'll see in the next slide that I'm going to show you, there's kind of a method of how this works. Usually the pre-seed is sort of a lower amount of money, $250,000 to $1 million. As we've seen here, it's happening oftentimes with safes, convertible notes, maybe sometimes common share equity if you can set a valuation. The seed is a little bit further, right? A little bit of a larger potential raise, comes from friends and family, angels, maybe some early stage VCs, maybe even startup accelerators actually invest directly into, like Mars or Communitech or the DMZ. They all have these like startup accelerator funds also that they invest directly into the startups themselves. And then as you progress later on, then let's say you've already done your seed round, then you might move on to a Series A preferred round. The next one after that would be a Series B preferred round. And I put the little icons here so that you can see that pre-seed is normally friends and family and angels. Early stage, seed is friends and family, angels, some early stage VCs. The Series A, Series B, super angels, and VC, private equity, and then the Series C is normally like more of the larger VC funds and private equity. And this table over here, which I could share this with you afterwards, is showing you the breakdown of the normal typical size of raise, who the investor type is, what's the stage of the company when they're doing that round of financing, and what that's typically spent on. The top column, or I should say the top row, that talks about the raise size. Honestly, that changes all the time. Like a couple of years ago would have been way less. Now it's a lot higher, and it could change constantly. But this is just sort of an estimate of what those rounds are looking at right now. But again, it could change at any time. And that is the last slide I wanted to show. So there was a couple questions, not questions. It was just saying bye. Okay, so I'll just leave it to anybody to ask any quick questions for 5 minutes, and then we'll wrap it up from here.
Yeah, guys, any questions? Because what Allan has presented today, and thank you so much, Allan, because